We have an explosive debate lined up for you today. Remember Zoubida? Well, she's challenged me to a debate on the current Israeli-Gaza conflict. So, never one to back down. I'm stepping up to the challenge and she's back on the channel. Zoubida, you called me out. You wanted to debate Israel-Palestine. Over to you.
Yeah, so thanks for having me on again. Obviously, we did speak a couple of years ago during the time of the Sheikh Jarrah crisis. And, the situation was bad and now it's completely got worse. As we know, on October the 7th, Palestinians decided to resist against their occupier. And since then, I believe that Israel has been committing a genocide and has been disproportionately responding to what happened on October the 7th towards Palestinians in order to, what I believe, achieve a long term goal of theirs, which is this expansionist goal of completely ethnically cleansing Palestinians, starting off in Gaza and then, making their way to the West Bank, which has already been in the process for a while. To establish, a much more greater Israel. And I'd be happy to delve into why I think that.
I think you checked about every single cliche and soundbite you could have into there. Genocide, ethnic cleansing, expansionist. What's happening is very, very simple, Zoubida. It's literally, it could not get more simple. On the 7th of October, Hamas did and Palestinians did what you described as resistance. They came into Israel. They butchered hundreds of civilians, hundreds of security personnel in what we would describe as an unprovoked attack. On the 6th of October, Hamas and Israel were effectively, although not directly, within a ceasefire. They weren't at peace. Hamas has been hostile to Israel since its inception, but there was no conflict. Most of the conflict that had been happening in Gaza had been between Islamic Jihad and between Israel. On the 7th of October, they came into Israel. They butchered the elderly. They butchered women. They butchered children. They took back hostages to Gaza, Holocaust survivors, babies, etc. There is no genocide. Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. They pulled out. They were not in there. That is not the actions of an expansionist government or an expansionist nation. That is the action of a nation that wants peace with its neighbor. But instead of creating a peaceful platform to build upon, Hamas seized control of Gaza, drove out their competition, Fatah, and then built up their military capabilities until they were able to strike a blow upon Israel, and they did. And now, tragically for the people of Gaza, they are now suffering the consequence of that barbaric act of treachery.
So you said that it was an unprovoked attack, which is not true. Again, a group of people who are occupied by every metric, by the way, via the United Nations, via international law, via the UK government, via the United States Department, Palestine, including Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, are all defined as occupied. So when you are an occupied group of people, you do have the right to resist. And to suggest that it's unprovoked is also
Just on that, how is Gaza occupied? Which Israelis were in Gaza?
right. So when we talk about occupation, the occupation that's going on in Gaza is not the same that we have in the West Bank. We know that in the West Bank it's a military occupation. In Gaza, it's a form of effective control. We know that Gazans do not have complete self-autonomy over their borders, over their economy, over the imports and the exports.
So don't, Beda, just very quickly on that. They don't have the right to enter Israel because Gaza and Israel are two nations that are hostile to each other, two people that are hostile to each other. Hamas are not on civil terms. They're not good in reality. They're not good neighbors to Israel. Egypt has a border with Gaza. Nobody accuses the Egyptians of occupying Gaza. It's an absurd notion to describe an occupation. It's absurd to describe the sealing of your border as an occupation. If Trump gets elected and seals the Mexican border, is he occupying Mexico?
Well, the context of Mexico and the United States is not the same as Palestine and Israel, okay? You say that they're hostile enemies.
No, it's a great question. Just answer the question, yes or no.
Well, To a certain
Yes or
extent,
no?
yes,
Would he be
because again, do
occupying?
do Palestinians have full control over their borders? The borders is what defines their area. If they cannot control who comes and enters their borders, then again, there's a level of occupation.
They,
Occupation is a level of
they
control. Okay, Gazans do not have full
sorry,
control.
Zoubida, they don't. What they control who comes into. If I set foot into Gaza, I will get slaughtered. They control who
Why would
comes
you
in.
get slaughtered?
Israel controls who comes into its borders, and Israel has sealed its border between, which is understandable. Why on earth would Israel open? It's a genuine
No,
question.
listen,
Why
I
on earth would
understand
Israel
border
open
control.
its border
I'm
to
not
Hamas?
against border control. Okay, I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying to you is the way in which that the border is controlled in Gaza, the power is more in Israel's hand, which again disenfranchises Palestinians. Okay, and it's not just simply about the borders, right? We're talking. Let me just make my point, because you did say some things that I still wanted to respond to. Okay, so again,
Okay,
we're looking
okay,
at
yeah,
the,
you're
the
right. You're right.
import and the exports. Okay, we know that the imports within that are allowed into Gaza are heavily limited by Israel. Okay, the exports as well are heavily limited by Israel. When we look at the airspace, they don't have control over that. They cannot build an airport. Now, you might suggest to me that the reason why they can't build an airport is because Hamas is going to sneak in weapons. But the airport was bombed in 2001, way before Hamas was even in control. Okay, when we look at the fact that Gaza has a coast, again, there is heavy restrictions on how far they can fish and how far they can't fish. So essentially, there is a level of effective control that is going on in Gaza. And I don't like to detach Gaza from the West Bank, right? The people in the West Bank and the people in Gaza are all Palestinians. So the West Bank is an extension of Gaza. So even though you might not say that Gaza is necessarily occupied in the way in which the West Bank is still Palestine. So there's still an occupation which affects all Palestinians. Hamas or any form of resistance that exists in Gaza is not just a resistance specific to Gaza, it's a resistance also to the West Bank. So when you say it's unprovoked, essentially what you're saying to me is that they don't have a right to defend themselves. And I would argue that there are so many grounds for them to defend themselves in the first place. Like I said, combining what is happening in Gaza, combining what is actively going on in the West Bank, what is the Palestinians supposed to do when it comes to, again, the ongoing military occupation in the West Bank, the effective control in Gaza, the illegal settlements that are being banned? How should Palestinians respond to these things?
Is murdering grandmothers and children resistance? No. You're the one using this word.
That specific act, no.
No. So they're not resisting, are they? No, good. So
well,
they weren't resisting.
Let's go
a
little bit deep
civilians.
into that, because, I would argue, I can ask you the same question, is murdering little children defense?
Absolutely not. Murdering children is immoral.
And this is what Israel, as it stands,
by any
standard. As it stands, Israel has killed, I think, 18,000.
So have you? I challenge you, Zoubida, because I've done extensive research on this. So the Hamas Ministry of Health releases the IDs of all the people they have been able to identify. I went through the IDs that they'd released. So these are the ones they're saying they've counted. Now, this was a month or so ago. There was around 24,000 on there. Of those, a huge proportion were invalid IDs. I've actually written a formula. I'm happy to share it, where you can do a validation check on the IDs. How the IDs work is they're 9-digit IDs. The 9th digit is the check on the 8 digits. So if you run the query on the 9th digit, you can then analyze whether you can validate whether an ID is actually a real ID. There was a huge proportion of them. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a video on my channel. People can watch it. A huge proportion of these IDs were invalid. They were fake IDs. Others were missing IDs. And the UN then did a whole press conference on why they rely on the Hamas Ministry of Health's IDs and how they validated them. And they were forced to admit that 10,000 of the verified IDs weren't even verified. When you couple that with Israel making claims of 15,000 Hamas fighters, and this was a while ago, had been killed in the conflict, you're looking at a 1-to-1 civilian to death to militant ratio. So you can throw around accusations of genocide, but in almost, we've up there, I think it says 275 days of fighting now. You've got, by the Hamas's numbers, which are wrong, you've got over 30,000, and that's an exaggerated number. You then deduct 15,000 of those, and let's say Israel isn't 100% accurate. If you want to challenge that and knock that down by a few thousand, fine. But you're still talking an incredibly low civilian to militant death toll. and a very, very low death toll overall when compared to other conflicts in the region. So when you look at Iraq, 1 million, Syria, 500,000 to 1 million, Afghanistan, like huge hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered. No one talks about a genocide. Israel has gone to greater lengths than any other nation in the history of military campaigns to reduce civilian casualties in a heavily built up area. That's why they've made millions of flyers, made millions of phone calls, went to huge lengths to move civilian population from one territory into a safe territory or a relatively safer area throughout the fight, created humanitarian corridors, allowed over 500,000 tons of aid into the Strip. That's not the example of a genocidal government. The contrast is Hamas, who went in and butchered civilians. That was genocidal. They butchered them because they were Jews. They butchered them because they were associated with Israel. And so, like always, it's projection, pure and simple. Hamas are genocidal. They want to genocide Jews. Israel is a diverse, multicultural society which has no ill intentions to its Muslim citizens or its Muslim neighbors. But it will, if you come into Israel's territory and kidnap its babies and kidnap its pensioners, it will rain fire on those who perpetrated that heinous act.
Okay, I'd like a full response if you don't mind. So the fact that you started off your response by talking about invalidated IDs does not discount the fact that there have been thousands of children who have been murdered by the IDF. The Gaza Health Ministry, I know you keep on referring to it as Hamas, and your understanding of Hamas, which I believe most Zionist understanding of Hamas, is based on the military wing. But Hamas is a much more broader organization who also, governs certain institutions which existed before Hamas even came about. So, for instance, let's just say that there is a hospital that we have in the UK, and tomorrow, I don't know, the Communist Party decided to govern the country. Does that now mean that that hospital infrastructure is, utilized in communism, or does that mean that the communists now just rule over the party, rule over the country where the hospital is run? So, to try and associate the Gaza Health Ministry necessarily with Hamas is not necessarily true. It's a separate institution that is being governed by Hamas, and so the United States have actually validated and used their statistics before. And as you know, Gaza is a very densely populated area. So when it comes to counting numbers, you have to bear in mind that there are people who have been so severely dismembered that they're going through the identification process because their face and their hands have been completely blown off. Then you have to account for the people that are completely missing. And I'm sure that, even from a cultural perspective, 2.1 million people, communities are very interconnected. People know each other. And if there is somebody missing from the family, then this would definitely be a red flag. So I'm not, what you're saying does not discount the fact that there have been thousands and thousands of children murdered, even by the United Nations, statistics. The overwhelming majority of the casualties are women and children. You claim that you are targeting Hamas, but again, if we analyze...
How do you know that?
Well, we've looked at the United Nations statistics. The last time that they put their statistics up, I know many Zionists ran with this.
Which United Nations statistics? Which United Nations statistics?
Well, we can go to Ultra.
Sorry, who's Ultra?
So Ultra is the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Human Affairs, and they have a article here about Gazans' children being under attack, and they list some statistics of the amount of children that have been inflicted by the ongoing conflict as early as 2008, 2003. And they have a sort of count of the children that have been killed since 2003.
Okay,
and,
so sorry,
the statistics, to say the least, are completely shocking. So I'm not trying to do semantics with numbers because I think it's very insensitive.
So I was just going to say, I thought you were mispronouncing it, but they're both using the same statistics. The statistics come directly from the Hamas Ministry of Health. If you read the asterisks on either reports or either websites, if you're looking at the websites, they will say this is from the Hamas Ministry of Health. And it's the ID list I just spoke about. It's the list of IDs, which a month ago was 24,000. I'm sure it's gone up a little bit since then. If you run analysis on it, you will find a number of those IDs are not that the United Nations didn't even bother to validate them. I'm an absolute computer illiterate. I am terrible with technology. Yeah, I was able to run an Excel query on the list of IDs and identify a huge proportion of them as not being valid. I'll get that exact number while you're talking, but we're still talking about the Hamas numbers.
Right, I understand, but that still does not invalidate the thousands of children who have actively been killed in Gaza. I mean, I've also myself witnessed cases of, the Hind Rajab case, the 6-year-old girl who was brutally murdered in a car whilst her family were dead. Over 300 bullets were consecutively fired at this car. Clearly non-combatant car. We don't know, what the reason for 325 bullets being fired on a car which had a child within it. We have seen the dismembered bodies of children again in refugee camps. When you talk about the 1-to-1 ratio, this is actually incorrect by the Israeli standards. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the technology that they have been using called lavender, and the source this that provides this actually comes from Israeli sources. You can research it as I'm speaking. It's called Lavender AI Systems. This was a technology that was used by Israel, and according to this technology, the ratio that they were happy with was a 1-to-20 ratio, not a 1-to-1 ratio. And at times, sometimes the ratio has been high from 1 to 100. So there was a specific case in Jabalia refugee camp. There were civilians there, and according to the IDF, there was one Hamas soldier there. And I will give you the evidence whilst you respond. But there was one Hamas soldier there, and according to Israel, it was completely fine to fire a airstrike within that refugee camp, knowing that there were civilians there for one person. So in cases like that, the ratio was 1 to 100. I don't believe that Israel is being precise in the way in which that they are targeting Hamas. I think they're being deliberate. And again, when it comes to genocide, I'm not using these buzzwords to make myself sound smart. Okay, genocide is largely defined by its intent. Okay, and we can see the intentional genocidal statements that have been said by the president, by the prime minister, by rabbis, by members of the Knesset who have called for complete extermination of Gaza. They've called for nuclear bombs in Gaza. Yes, you may say that some of them were reprimanded, but at that point, the damage has been done, especially when you have a bunch of angry IDF soldiers who are being indoctrinated with extreme violent rhetoric. Then that's the type of actions that we're going to see being replicated in Gaza. So, and again, a genocide is not necessarily defined by the numbers. We know that there are some genocides with a death count of 3,000, some as low as 1,000, and some as high as 6 million. So to do this numbers game still doesn't detract from the fact that it is not a genocide. And I just lastly want to finish up, we have the death toll, which is horrendous, but we also have the mass destruction that's also being caused in Gaza. 70% of Gaza's infrastructure has been completely destroyed. Every university has been leveled. There are only a handful of hospitals that are actively operating to basically deal with 1.1 million people have been displaced and thousands of people that have been injured. The IDF, in their process of eliminating Hamas, have completely leveled over 300,000 homes. Now, from a mathematical point of view, I don't understand what the relevance of that is, because according to Israel, there are 30,000 Hamas members. So according to them, justifying why 300,000 homes needed to be leveled means that one Hamas soldier must have been in 30 homes at the same time. And bearing in mind, you guys also claim that you have hostages that are within these facilities. So what we are seeing is complete mass destructions in hopes that one of the airstrikes ends up killing a Hamas soldier. And lastly, even according to the IDF, their identification process of who Hamas is and who isn't is very skewed and very flawed. For instance, even just being affiliated to Hamas could end you a death sentence, as we saw in the case of Ismail Haniya's grandchildren, who, just because they were his grandchildren, were killed during airstrikes which were supposed to be for his sons. Again, being affiliated could be something as being related, or even being in close contact with them for a very short period of time. And going back to the Lavender AI technology system, they even said that they identified 37,000 Hamas affiliates, some low ranking, and just being a low ranking Hamas affiliate could also get you killed. So even for them, it's pretty much everybody's Hamas, and a small affiliation, just like a conversation or being related, could be enough to say that you are Hamas and you deserve to be killed. So I don't think they're being precise. I don't think they're being strategic. Their rhetoric, their actions is very indicative of them trying to commit a genocide and trying to completely destroy Gaza.
Sorry. So as you rightfully said,
You're
genocide
muted.
has a definition. It was coined by a Jew, Raphael Lemkin, to describe the genocide of the Jews, or describe the atrocity that was inflicted upon the Jewish people when, in 1930s and 40s Germany, Europe, the Nazis tried to exterminate the Jewish race. And that's where the word genocide comes from. Genos and side. Side is killing, genos is race. Genocide, to kill a race. Now let's contrast that to Israel. In Israel, there are millions of Arabs who you would describe as Palestinian. They sit in the government. I'm here at the moment. If I step to my local mall here, Hadar Mall, it's filled with Muslims and Jews coexisting and shopping and living a perfectly normal life alongside each other. The Arabs of Israel have political representation. Arab judges have sent Jewish prime ministers and presidents to jail. There is no desire to change this. Israel not only does not seek to genocide Arabs, or the Palestinians as you'd call them, but it seeks to coexist and live alongside with them and protect their rights here. What we're describing in Gaza is not the genocide. As you rightfully identified, Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas of in this region, in the Middle East. There is around half the population is 18 years or under. So you are fighting. Hamas has launched a military war, a military campaign in one of the most densely populated and youngest populated areas in the world. They've built up their infrastructure, their military infrastructure within there. I've seen it. I've been there. I've been to the Gaza border while I'm here. They've got military infrastructure under schools, under mosques. The reason why there has been such tragic devastation of civilian infrastructure in Gaza is because Hamas have waged a war from that infrastructure. They've hit, even before this war, the United Nations Relief Work Agency were on record of complaining about Hamas hiding rockets in their schools. It's like in the public record. And UNRWA is now being shown to be completely morally corrupt, morally bankrupt, and completely taken over by Hamas in Gaza. There were literally UNRWA workers who were involved in the massacre of Jews on October the 7th. So tragically for the Palestinians, tragically for those innocent people, and every child in my eyes is innocent. Every Arab child living in Gaza, their life is as sacred as every Jewish child living in Israel. There's no difference. Children are innocent, and they are the true victims of this barbarism and this conflict that Hamas has instigated. And so to come back to the genocide, in every genocide, you can look at the intentions of those which are perpetrating the genocide. And I wouldn't argue with you. There will definitely be Israelis who are fighting in Gaza who will have carried out acts that I would rate as beyond the pale. Because in war, people do horrible things. But we can't look at the actions of individual soldiers. We have to look who defy military command and military orders. We have to look at the actual institutions themselves, the government, the nation. And that's where we can say there clearly isn't an attempt at genocide. Otherwise, you have to explain how and why Israel would allow 500,000 tons of aid, over 500,000 tons of aid into Gaza, why it goes to such lengths as dropping millions of flyers on neighborhoods, creating maps to show civilians where to go to, because there's going to be an incursion into that neighborhood to eliminate a Hamas threat that is embedded within that community. So you have to explain to me, where is the intention? Why is Israel going to and putting its own soldiers at risk? If you warn your enemy that you're about to make an incursion into their territory, they can prepare themselves. They can buttress themselves into their defensive infrastructure. They can flee. They can move around. They can lay ambushes and booby traps because they know that you're coming into their territory. So no military does that in the history of warfare, yet Israel is doing this. If Israel wants to genocide Palestinian civilians, why is it warning basically anyone within that region of an imminent military campaign there? Why is it allowing 500,000 tons of aid? Why is it making millions of phone calls? Why is it dropping millions of flies? Why is it creating humanitarian corridors? Why is it putting its own soldiers at risk to preserve civilian life?
Okay, So I'd like to respond to the first point that you spoke about Palestinians living in Israel, and you claim that you don't have a issue. Israel doesn't have an issue with Arabs. The fact that you guys can't even refer to them as Palestinians based on their true ethnic origin shows how much respect you have for them. They're not simply just Arabs; they're Palestinians. And if we actually look at the history of those Palestinians who live in Israel, it wasn't a positive history. Hey, come be an Israeli citizen. You're forgetting to mention the fact that from 1948 up until 1954, those 2.1 million Arabs that lived there were actually living under martial law. They were not given the right to vote. They were not equal citizens. They were subjected to random curfews to the point where a massacre occurred called the Kafir Qasim massacre, where the IDF issued a random curfew for those Palestinians, unbeknown to them. And if they did not reach back to the refugee camps in which that they lived in, then they were massacred, including children. So it took quite a while for these Palestinians to be incorporated into Israeli society. There's also been suggestions by some right-wing politicians within the Knesset to do a population exchange. And there have also been polls to suggest that if they had a choice to exchange the Palestinians who lived in Israel with other more Jewish people, then they would advocate for them to be sent to the West Bank to increase the Jewish population. And we know that there are certain laws as well, or bills that have been passed within Israel to define Israel as a Jewish state for Jewish people. Okay, so the basis of Israel is a state that was created for Jewish people. And as we know that many Jewish people, irregardless of where they're from, can utilize birthright to get immediate citizenship. So it is a state that is basically catered to a specific ethnicity. And those Palestinians essentially do technically live, like they're walking on eggshells. As much as you say that they have governmental representation, there is absolutely zero chances of them actually getting any power or being elected prime minister or president, because there's not enough people that will vote for them. So they're largely disenfranchised in that sense. And we know since October the 7th, many Palestinians who live in Israel who have voiced their contempt against Israel have been arrested for simple things like posting something on WhatsApp. So to act as if it's all dandy, it's got a very dark history. Many of those people are refugees themselves, fleeing from other Palestinian towns and villages as a result of the Nakba. Going back to the genocide again, you said that the soldiers may be acting in a certain way out of rage, but let's look at the actual infrastructure and let's look at the people in positions of power, which is very important. So Netanyahu himself has said some very, very genocidal statements, referring to Palestinians as Amalek, almost invoking religious scripture to add a very negative connotation towards Palestinians. On October the 13th, he said, Gaza is the city of evil. We will turn all places in which Hamas deploys and hides into ruins. I am telling the people of Gaza, get out of there now. We will act everywhere and with full power. So he's basically saying that all of Gaza is essentially a legitimate target. And again, on October the 28th, he said, you must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our holy Bible. Now, you might say that there's context to that. He's referring to Hamas, but aren't Hamas Palestinians? Hamas are technically Palestinians. So again, to define a Palestinian militant group in that way, you are also extending that rhetoric towards Palestinians who live in Gaza. It's no different from me, talking about people within Israel, calling them a specific name. I'd be the first to be called anti-Semitic. And again, when you talk about them, giving aid, we know that a lot of aid has been delayed. I actually speak to people from Egypt who are sitting at the border, sitting at the crossing, waiting for the aid to come back in, and there are major delays because, as you know, when the aid is coming in, it has to be checked, and most of the boxes are emptied in a very dehumanizing, degrading way, and then they're not put back in. The people have to essentially put the aid back in, and if there's one faulty issue, then the aid is not coming in. There have been multiple reports of aid basically expiring because it's just been sat at the crossing for a very long time. And also we have many cases of starvation and people dying of starvation, specifically in the north, because of the delay of aid simply getting in. Again, I have had the conversations with people in Gaza, and they tell me the condition, and yes, it varies depending on where you are. The north has been completely affected. Aid is delayed getting over that side, even though there's technically two crossings close to that vicinity. Okay, and the water that they are receiving is absolutely inadequate, and then you have people who have been displaced from the north all the way into the south. So the resources is very scarce. The need for resources is completely scarce. Again, the United Nations has a database to deal with what they call, risk of famine. And in certain areas, the risk of famine is completely imminent. So what I feel like your argument is, we're not committing a genocide because we're not doing it as brutal and as fast enough as you'd like, right? And as we know, a genocide, even when it came to the Holocaust, didn't happen in one go. It happened through a long period of years throughout time. So to suggest that it's not a genocide because there's not enough people killed, and the fact that Israel, I mean, again, with all due respect, during the Holocaust, during Auschwitz, they still fed the Jews that were in these camps, by the way. They gave them food, they gave them, sustenance in order to continue committing the genocide. So that's what they're doing, the same thing in Gaza. Just because they're letting aid in does not mean that they don't have long-term intentions of completely ethnically cleansing these people. And lastly, um, when we look at your government is made up of some of the most fringe far-right extremists, I think, in the world. People like Ben Gvir, people like Smotrich, completely unhinged. And during the onslaught in Gaza, Ben Gvir attended a conference called the Gaza Resettlement Conference, if you can go and research that up. And it was a conference that was held by multiple Knesset Likud member parties, Ben Gvir and rabbis, who suggested that they should resettle Gaza and call for the basically repatriation of Palestinians elsewhere. So you can imagine there is a conflict going on, right? There are people being slaughtered, and instead of trying to find some solutions, you're suggesting long-term goals of how to resettle the place and establish, your own settlements in Gaza as it's actively being destroyed. So that indicates to me that there are ulterior motives as to what they want to do in Gaza and in the West Bank. As of recently, more settlements have been approved. So there is an expansionist ideology going on here.
Okay, so there's a lot to cover. So if I was typing there, I was just making notes of the various different areas that you went over. So I'm going to do the same. I'm going to work my way from the beginning of what you said to the end of what you said. So you started describing how Palestinians, as you described them, they don't call themselves Palestinians, but you want to call them Palestinians, Arabs living in Israel. Many of my friends are Israeli Arabs. They reject the identity of Palestinian. It's a modern identity that was created in reaction to Zionism. Palestine was the name that the British gave the region. The Palestinians then were largely Jews. The Palestinian football team, the Palestinian wine company, Palestinian electric company, all of these organizations and institutions were Jewish. They were all Jewish institutions. So much so in our last debate, you gave the quote of Oni Abd al-Hadi, and I responded with what he claimed in 1936, which is Palestine is a term the Zionists invented. There has never been a country called Palestine. In the 60s largely, but a little bit before then, Palestinians adopted the identity which the British forced upon them. It's an entirely post-colonial construct. So the Palestinian nationalism, the keffiyeh that you're wearing, was designed by John Pasha Glubb. Pasha John Glubb. He was a British man. The Palestinian flag of the Arab Revolt was designed by an Englishman, Mark Sykes, from the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Mark Sykes being a British diplomat. The entire Palestinian identity is a construct, a post-colonial construct in reaction to the indigenous rights movement, the Zionist movement. Now, to come back to Israel today, because we've done history before, we don't really need to go there, but to come back to history today, to come back to today, you say that the Arabs don't have equal rights here and they don't have political representation. That's nonsense. Have you heard of Mansour Abbas? Not Mahmoud Abbas, Mansour Abbas. He was a member of the government in the previous government. He has a very, very large Arab Muslim political party, Sunni Muslim political party in Israel. There are many Arab parties. There are many Arab members of Knesset MPs. The idea that Arabs don't hold and have political office here is a fantasy constructed by those who've never visited here. Anyone who's ever stepped foot in Israel is laughing at what you're saying right now. The idea that Arabs don't have the same rights as Jews here is insane. And you said that an Arab can't become prime minister. That's nonsense. They absolutely can become prime minister. They can become anything in this country. This country does not discriminate based on one's race or religion. And so the only people who advance this lie are those that have never been here. And then let's look at those politicians we're talking about. Yes, you may find one or two right-wing members of Knesset in the current government who hold views that I actually reject. I don't side with their views. I disagree with them. I'm a bleeding heart liberal. However, When we contrast that to the other side, they look like Mother Teresa. Let me just read a few quotes to you. Let me just read a few quotes. We must attack every Jew on planet Earth. We must slaughter and kill them with Allah's help. That's from Fatih Hamad. Another quote from Ahmed Bahar. Oh Allah, destroy the Jews and their supporters. Oh Allah, destroy the Jews, not the Zionists, not the Israeli, destroy the Jews. They literally told us days after October the 7th that they would do it again and again and again and again. If you want genocidal intention, look at the butchers that you're cheerleading for. Look at the butchers who are you coming on this live stream and describing as resistors of an occupation. When asked to describe the occupation, oh, well, Israel doesn't have an open border with Gaza. Clearly there's an occupation. It's a fantasy and it's a projection because there is genocidal intent. There is genocidal, extreme far-right speech, and it's coming from the jihadis that you're cheerleading for. It's coming from the groups that proudly describe themselves as jihadi, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who wage genocidal wars against the Jews. It's not, you want to talk about ethnic cleansing? There's no Jews left in the Arab world. There's very few Jews left in the Muslim world. Why? Because they were ethnically cleansed. There's millions of Arabs in Israel who have complete religious freedom, be they Christian or Muslim. There are hundreds of mosques and churches. I can't take 2 footsteps out of my house without walking past a Muslim who's freely practicing their faith. And you know the insanity of this. I had a Muslim taxi driver the other day, and they are volunteering to help those that are Jews and Muslims that have been damaged and affected by this war. There are literally Muslim medics who are putting their lives at risk to save Jews, who are putting their lives at risk to save those Muslims who were butchered by Hamas. And when they went back to rescue people on October 7th, there were Bedouin men who were going backwards and forwards to save Jews and anyone they found who was being butchered by Hamas on October the 7th. Those heroes were indiscriminately slaughtered by Hamas when those dogs from Jahannam caught them. And they are true heroes. They are true examples of what a devout Muslim would do. These are Muslims that were putting their own lives at risk to save Jews from these jihadi savages from Gaza, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So you went on. And so you went on to give quotes from Netanyahu and the likes. And even in your quotes, you like refuted yourself. You're saying, look, he's talking about Amalek, and he's literally preceding the statement with Hamas. They're talking about a Gaza, a city of evil. We're going to destroy, raze to the ground any institutions that Hamas are using, any built infrastructure, that Hamas are using. That Hamas, not Palestinians. Israel makes the distinction between Palestinian, civilian, and Hamas and Islamic Jihad. In contrast, the Palestinian politicians I shared with you, the Hamas politicians, they are talking about slaughtering the Jews wherever you find them. Their speech is no different from Nazis, and their actions was no different from Nazis. You talked about aid being piled up. Just go on Twitter and look. You can literally see drone shots of huge stockpiles of aid on the Gazan side. The reason there's been difficulty getting aid into different places is because the infrastructure within Palestine, within Gaza, has completely collapsed. So you have UNRWA no longer able to deliver aid. Because IEDs are planted in roads, Israel tears up roads before it moves into them to remove the risk of IEDs taking out their troops, which has happened multiple times, which is why now Israel removes roads. So there's logistical reasons why it's hard to distribute aid within Gaza, but there's no restriction from Israel on getting the aid in, and that's why it's piling up on the Gazan side, and you can literally see drone footage after drone footage of huge stockpiles. It doesn't matter who you're talking to on the Egyptian side, you can look at the drone footage yourself on Twitter after this. And so we're in this situation where we have the first genocide, where it's a 1-to-1 civilian to militant ratio, the first famine, where nobody's dying. Do you not think if there was a famine, your social media feed would be filled with thousands and thousands of images of starving Palestinians? But they're not there. For the IPC, which is the institution here, or the rating that you mentioned, there's an agreed standard. It's a famine warning system, which is brought into by institutions like the United Nations, the Red Cross, etc. And they've agreed a standard as to what a famine is. And they declare it a famine. It's phase 5, which is where you're actually in a famine, when 2 out of 10,000 people are being killed. 2 out of 10,000. Now, they declared a famine as early as November, and they said back then it was affecting, I think, 377,000 people from memory. I made a video about this. Please go and check it out. It'll educate anyone who's watching this. It's a short video, but it absolutely shatters the myth of a famine. Now, if there were 2 in 377,000, and then they increased that going up to 1.1 million people being affected by famine, phase 5, we would be expecting over 30,000 people would have died from malnutrition. That's like the death toll you're basically quoting for the entire war. The death toll would have doubled, but it hasn't, because no one is dying from a famine, because guess what? There isn't a famine, just like there isn't a genocide. This is the first famine that's killed nobody, the first genocide where it's a 1-to-1 civilian to militant ratio. And the comparisons between Auschwitz are disgusting. In the death camps of Auschwitz, the Jews weren't sustained. They were taken on trains and then sent to their death. Sent to their death. There wasn't hundreds of thousands of aid being given to sustain them. There wasn't humanitarian corridors. There wasn't safe zones created. There wasn't maps. There weren't phone calls. They sent them to their death. This is a gross perversion of the word genocide, and it's a gross perversion of the reality. This war would end tomorrow if Hamas surrendered and released the hostages. They initiated this war, and it's the innocent Palestinians who are going to suffer. But Israel will and should neutralize this threat.
Okay, there was a lot said, so I'd like a full response. So going back to, let's start off with the Palestinian identity. You say that this is a new identity that has been invented at the turn of the 19th or 20th century, and that the Kufiya was coined or created by a British man. The word Kufiya has its origins in the word Kufa. Kufa is a Iraqi city town, and this is where the Kufiya actually comes from. It's actually an Iraqi headdress, had nothing to do with the British. Palestinians were referring to themselves as Palestinians way before the British Mandate, as early as the 1800s, just like many other people were referring to themselves as the new national identity that they've established after the turn of the 20th century. So what you're trying to do is try to use new colonial terms in terms of how one defines themselves as a nation, and saying, well, because Palestinians didn't use nationalistic terms, therefore they weren't actually a people. Palestine is a place. The people who live within Palestine are defined as Palestinians. Palestine is an exclusive identity as well, unlike the Israeli one, because you could be a Palestinian Jew, Palestinian Christian, Palestinian atheist. But as we know in Israel, the Israeli identity is largely based off the fact if you are Jewish or not. This is why, again, going back to the birthright, somebody who is born in Australia, never been to the Middle East, but just at the fact that he's Jewish or has a Jewish parent, he has the right to obtain full citizenship and go and move to Israel. So it's a very inclusive identity, strictly based off the fact that you're Jewish or not. Again, going back to, the Palestinian identity only being a creation born out of colonialism, well, we could say exactly the same thing about Israel. Jewish people were not calling themselves Israeli for thousands of years. They called themselves Jews or Judean, right? This Israel is a colonial invention, essentially, right? Israel did not exist prior to 1948. Okay, what you had is what you would call the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Judea, which again are kingdoms which barely lasted over 500 years. With all due respect, you can't name me any Jewish empire that lasted for thousands of years. They were very short-winded empires. I'm not going to sit here and deny that Jewish people didn't have an existence and establish a small kingdom in that land after the Canaanites, sure, but to suggest that this history is the basis for why you need to have a Jewish state, I think is absolutely ridiculous. I think the Romans would probably have more of an argument to re-establish themselves in this land under a Roman province, because again, when we look at the definition of Zionism, it is the re-establishment of a Jewish homeland. And what they are essentially trying to re-establish is the presence that they had there 3,000 years ago, which was very, very minimal. And again, how can you reestablish yourself over a pre-existing people? If you go onto the Jewish Virtual Library, it has statistics of the Jewish and non-Jewish population prior to 1948, and we can see that there were millions of what you guys classify as non-Jews, i.e. Palestinians, living in that land. So to act as if the Palestinian identity never existed, it's a made-up thing, it was a invention of the British, I would say that's a classical case of projection, because Palestinians have maintained a continuity in that land, right? Generation after generation, they've established themselves in that land for thousands of years. And with all due respect, as we know, the expulsion of the Jews resulted in them becoming a very large diaspora, and the majority of them spent longer in exile than they did in the land. So I think it's a very ambiguous claim, a very entitled claim to say that once upon a time, 3,000 years ago, maybe my ancestors lived here, because if that's the case, then many other people like the Romans, like the Vikings, could make the same claim for Britain. So it's a very colonial project, and again, initially Zionism was not rooted on the fact that Jews are indigenous to Palestine. That was never the argument. The argument was based off the fact that we want a nationalist movement, and because we're suffering anti-Semitism, and the way in which that you achieved that is you worked with colonizers, right? The British, who were colonialists at the time, biggest empire in the world, you colluded, you worked, you partnered up with them in order to achieve these means. So you got the land through force, through colonialism. You didn't get the land because you were indigenous to the land, and you had this divine claim to it. No, you got it through force, and you maintain it through force, by the way, as well. um and again, when we go back to the ethnic cleansing, you say there's no ethnic cleansing. Well, it's not like the first time you haven't committed ethnic cleansing. We know 100 million percent the Nakba happened. We know 100 million percent that ethnic cleansing and depopulating of villages happened before the 1948 war, like in 1947, even 43, where you guys specifically militarily, strategically targeted Palestinian villages, wiped out any form of resistance, going back to the village files, which was an operation that was conducted by your terrorist organizations, the Haganah, the Ergon, and the Lehi, in order to document the names of Palestinians who lived in these villages, and any male that was known to be a part of any sort of military resistance was to be taken out first. So I refuse to believe this argument that when you talk about the Nakba, that the conflicts that you had with the people were military conflicts, because you'd already got rid of the military fractions and any male that was involved within any sort of military activity. You killed them, or you either exiled them. So I think a lot of your rhetoric is actually projection, and you use these words like savage, terrorist, and whatever in regards to Hamas. But Hamas is only existing to this day at the behest of Israel. You've had a window since 1987 to completely wipe them out, okay? Especially when they were weak. You didn't. You allowed them to grow because you thought that you could use them against the PLO, and it's gone against you, right? You allowed them to get funding again. You literally had a corridor for Qatar to come and hand over cash directly to Hamas. So you guys have a part to play in building them up. October the 7th also was a complete neglect on the side of Israel. One of the most military sophisticated armies in the world with the best technology. How on earth were they able to get outsmarted on October the 7th? And I would argue that again, it was due to negligence from Israel's side. Israel needed an excuse to do what they're doing in Gaza, and with all due respect, this might offend you, but I believe that Israel is willing to sacrifice its own people like it's done before. We're all aware of the notorious Hannibal Directive, where they've conceded to the fact that a dead Israeli is better than a live one held in the hands of the enemy. There have been multiple investigations as to how some of the people died on October the 7th, and some of them were killed by Israel. In some of the kibbutzim, there were literal commands from generals who gave the green lights to kill their own civilians, as long as they get Hamas. So Israel doesn't have a problem with sacrificing its own people, endangering its own people in order to achieve its means. I would argue that Israel uses its own citizens as human shields, because again, to have a festival, and again, 3.1 miles from occupied territory, knowing that there are terrorists operating there. Again, I would say that this is putting them in a combat area. They're putting them in a dangerous area, because Israel was very arrogant. They didn't think that something like this would happen. I've seen some of the cases of the IDF soldiers who have fallen in Gaza, some of them as young as 18 years old. Now, that indicates to me that in order to join the IDF, we know it's mandatory. You have to be 18. So this 18-year-old has just joined the IDF, has zero experience in warfare, and the last conflict that they had was in 2021. He would have been 15 or 14 years old when that happened. So absolutely no training in terms of combat or in warfare, and completely flung into Gaza to be sacrificed. This is why there is complete uproar in Israel now because of Netanyahu just sending these young men to essentially get slaughtered. So just to wrap up my points, I think there's too much projection, too much blame on the Palestinians, even though they're not as powerful as you guys. They don't have an active military. They don't even have a state, right? So to even equate them at the same as you and to hold them to the same standards is absolutely ridiculous. There's not enough accountability on Israel's side, because again, October the 7th was inevitable. It was bound to happen, because when you completely ignore and neglect the cries of a group of people who are asking for basic human rights, then eventually they're going to take matters into their own hands, and they're going to utilize the United Nations resolution, which basically says any occupied group of people have the right to an armed resistance by any means necessary. So I think instead of pivoting, blaming the Palestinians for resisting occupation, maybe you should actually look at the source of why this is happening, treat the disease rather than the symptoms. Because I haven't heard you once, really condemn Israel and its actions and what kind of led up to this.
So I'll start with something I agree with, because I think it's beneficial to both of us to find points of agreement. I would actually agree with you that Israel made mistakes with Hamas. It was very well known that Qatar were coming in with suitcases filled with cash that was given to Hamas. Israel misjudged, the state misjudged, the military misjudged the situation in Gaza. Israel, and as a consequence of that misjudgment, tragically, the most innocent and purest of Israelis suffered. Children, babies, Holocaust survivors. When you use language, and here's where I disagree, when you use language like any means necessary, they have the right to resist. I disagree. Nothing you could do to me, nothing would make me go out and kidnap a baby or rape a woman or murder a Holocaust survivor. Nothing you could do to me would make me do that. And I've met you many times, Zoubida, in real life. I know there's nothing that somebody could do to you that would make you react that way. And I know, because we've had enough conversations both in person and online, to know that you don't endorse that behavior. So you're using language that you don't even agree with. You don't agree that, at least I hope you don't agree, that resistance by any means necessary. There is no justification for murdering children. There is no justification for kidnapping grandmas, great grandmothers. There's no justification. So I think it's really important to be careful with the language, the mantras.
Can I respond to that to maybe clarify? Because no, absolutely. I agree with you that, from a moral perspective, hurting anybody innocent, elderly or child is completely wrong. What I mean by any means necessary, again, they have a right to military resistance because they are being militarily occupied. Okay. Now, when it came to October the 7th, and I'm not sure if you've read this, but Hamas actually released a book, 17-page booklet called Our Narrative, where they specifically, detail why they did what they did on October the 7th. Okay. And, you might not care, you might not, but I think, in order to have balance, it's important to hear the other side, so that you can at least get a bit of context, because there has been a lot of misinformation that has been spreading. Now, from their perspective, and again, I want to make it clear, the killing of any innocent child, woman, person is completely unjustified. Okay, but at the same time, they have a right to resist, and they first specifically targeted IDF military bases before they got anywhere else. It was the IDF. They had to disrupt the communication there. That was the first point of defense for Israel. So that's who they targeted, which I'm sure you could say was legitimate. I don't think there's any disagreement there. Now, when it came to the festival, again, I think it was completely unwise to have a bunch of what you guys deem to be, civilians within that vicinity, knowing that it's so close to occupied territory. Now, this is where this might be something difficult that you might not agree with, but I would argue that many people who were there wouldn't be considered necessarily civilians in the way in which that we describe them. So, for instance, as we know, many people in Israel, it's mandatory for them to join the IDF from 18 to 20 years old. Many of the people that were there were active IDF members. And when you are an active IDF member, you're not like any other army, right? Like here in the UK, we have a British army. They're usually based in RAF camps, and they're only called when we're going to war. They don't patrol the streets. In Israel, I've seen footage in Israel of IDF soldiers walking around with guns freely on the train. We don't have that here in the UK. So your army is not just an army to protect Israel, but it's also there to maintain occupation. It's there to disenfranchise Palestinians. They are, to a certain extent, complicit in the occupation. We know that majority of the IDF are stationed in the West Bank. Okay, so you do have IDF members along the Gaza-Israel border, and the majority of them are in the West Bank, again, maintaining the occupation, protecting the settlers. For all we know, some of those people would have been complicit in crimes against Palestinians. Now, again, I would also say this is a negligent part on Israel. To suggest that your teenagers as young as 18, 19 years old join the military and thinking that there won't be no conflict, those people are now part of the military who also have to be involved in some sort of armed conflict. So I would say that this is Israel yet again endangering its people. And again, Hamas outlines this very clearly in their booklet, where they specifically say, well, if you have to join the army from the age of 18 to 20, then you are a part of the occupation. So therefore, you are also, so to speak, a legitimate target. And now you might say to me, oh, well, they were completely unarmed and they were not, didn't have any weaponry. But in the festival, there was people who had weaponry. There were Shin Bet there were police security officers there, and those people unfortunately got caught in the crossfire. But to define them specifically
I'm
as
sorry,
civilians, I would
I've got to
disagree,
interrupt.
because
Zoubida, I'm sorry, I can't actually listen to this. I've watched the massacre. There wasn't a crossfire. There were young girls running across a field screaming as Hamas militants, terrorists, scumbags sat there and shot them like they were pheasants, like they were game, screaming, God is great, Allahu Akbar, as they butchered young children, as they butchered young adults, 18 years old, 19 years old. You have no idea what you're talking about. And to describe that as legitimate resistance, to say that their murder is somehow justified, is absolutely disgusting. Hamas have no idea who was serving in the IDF and who wasn't. They were shooting whichever Jew they saw. And then they went on, after shooting the Jews, to shoot the Muslims. It's shameful that you would sit there and defend them. I've watched the video. I've watched the Hamas atrocity video that was the 47-minute video for the press. You can literally see them standing at the edge of a field, shooting and laughing and screaming, God is great. These butchers perverted and disgraced Islam. They disgraced the Arab nation and they disgraced humanity. And you, by sitting there and defending them, butchering like literal people, having a peace party, they were dancing for peace. For you to sit there and defend that is a disgrace on you. It's a shame on you.
I understand that you're sensitive about this, but the same sensitivity that you have for October the 7th, this did not start on October the 7th. Since 1948, over 100,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed by Israel. The numbers on the Israeli side are nowhere near compared. So I understand your frustration. Well, now you understand what it means to be a Palestinian. This has been ongoing in Palestine since 1948. I challenge you to bring me the statistics of I challenge you to bring me the statistics of the amount of Israelis killed by Palestinians in the last 76 years and the Palestinians killed by Israelis in the last 76 years. I challenge you to bring me the statistics of land seized by Palestinians. One second. I challenge you to bring me the land seized by Palestinians and the land seized by Israelis. It is incomparable. So I understand your frustration. I understand why you're upset. But again, it's a classical case of double standards and hypocrisy, because when Palestinians were going through multiple October the 7th by Israel, nobody cared. Now it's come to your doorstep. Now you finally decided to look at the Palestinian plight and actually understand how serious this is getting. This could have been avoided. But like I said, your government's policies, bad policies, which tells your population to join the army, not like any other army to protect and serve, but an army to maintain occupation. By default, you are endangering your own people.
So,
when you are allowing them to be in
Zoubida,
a combative zone close to military bases, again, you are endangering your people. When it comes to the innocent people, like I said earlier, any innocent person who was intentionally targeted, I condemn that. Okay, I'm not sitting here saying that elderly women and whatnot were not killed, but also I'm able to understand that there was crossfire from
there
the
was no
IDF.
crossfire.
The IDF
What are you
was
talking
involved in
about?
some of the
Where
killing.
was the crossfire? It was literally they paraglided into a festival and started gunning down innocent civilians. Where the fuck is? Sorry, where is the
So
crossfire?
were there not armed people at the festival?
There was
there
a
not armed people at the
smattering
festival?
of security guards who, like heroes, gave up their life,
Okay, what were they
returning
doing?
fire, not caught in the crossfire. Hamas was shooting civilians, and
Right.
some of the security
Crossfire.
guards. That's not what are you talking about? Crossfire. They landed in a festival and started intentionally shooting. That's not crossfire. They weren't shooting the
Hamas
security
is
guards.
shooting.
They were shooting the civilians. They weren't shooting the security guards. They were shooting the civilians. I've seen it with my own eyes. What are you talking about?
I understand that, but nonetheless, there was complete chaos. I'm reading the testimony of the IDF, right? This is not my own opinion. I've stopped giving my opinion a very long time. I'm going to give you what I have read based on my sources. If you go and look into the Times of Israel, the Haaretz, many articles, there are concessions that are made on the Israeli side who say that there was a lot of confusion. We were unprepared. They had to utilize WhatsApp and Telegram just to locate their location. There was mass confusion and mass panic, and this resulted in them, like, for instance, let's talk about how the fact that the original death toll that you guys...
You're going to the kibbutzim. We were talking about the
I'm
Nova
about
Festival.
I'm about to back up my point.
At the
I'm
Nova
about to back up my
Festival,
point.
at the Nova Festival, they paraglided in and started gunning down anyone that fled on the road. They set up roadblocks and they started gunning down anyone who drove past them. They were literally murdering civilians, and you are defending them. This is a shame on you. You will be judged as a Muslim. You will be judged on this on the Day of Judgment. You will be judged on your defense of these butchers who disgrace Islam, who disgrace Muhammad, who insert the name Islamic into their name and call themselves the Islamic Resistance, and they disgrace, these dogs of Jahannam disgrace your religion, and you disgrace yourself by defending their savagery. They murdered civilians. They murdered children. They murdered festival goers. The festival goers were not legitimate targets as you tried to frame it. They were not killed in the crossfire as you tried to present it. They were gunned down in cold blood by terrorist scumbags. And shame on you for siding with them.
And you know, I appreciate your frustration. It would have been nice for you to have the same frustration for the thousands and thousands of Palestinian children who have been murdered, for Hind Rajab.
I have the same frustration, but it's directed at Hamas.
300 bullets
directed at Hamas.
fired at her. Can I respond? Can I respond? Right, because again, you know, I understand you're upset, but again, to sit here and act as if this hasn't been going on to Palestinians for the last 76 years is completely disingenuous.
There is no festival.
And it shows.
No festival where
again,
Israel
you're denying it. You're part of the problem. You're completely denying. We're supposed to legitimize. Can I respond? We're supposed to legitimize Israeli suffering, right? We're supposed to call the death of 1,200 Israelis, nearly half of them being armed, as a genocide. But we can't even bear to utter the word genocide when there are nearly 40,000 people that have been killed in Gaza. Why is it a genocide when the death count is 1,200, but it's not a genocide. It's not a genocide. Can I finish? Because you've been able to obviously express yourself, right? What I'm saying to you is, why is it a genocide? And again, when we look at the death count, you guys initially said it was 1,900, right? Then you lowered it down to 1,500. Now it's 1,200 because you guys yourself actually mixed the Hamas dead soldiers in with the Israelis. So that's the level of confusion that you guys caused. You didn't know who you were targeting. You thought that the fallen dead Hamas soldiers were Israelis. So there was complete incompetence on you guys' side. And again, you've used the word genocide in context of October the 7th, even though it wasn't, because as we clearly identified that not everybody that was killed on October the 7th, not everybody that was taken hostage was even Jewish or Israeli anyway. So to act as if this was specifically targeted towards Jewish people is wrong. There were other people of different ethnicities, even Arab Bedouins, who were also taken as well. And again, 1,200, according to you, this is genocide. But 40,000 backed up with the mass destruction, backed up with the genocidal statements is not a genocide. And this is what we're talking about when we refer to you guys as supremacists, essentially, because the level that you guys dehumanize Palestinians is so disgusting that you don't even recognize any suffering on their part. And you're so stuck in this victim complex that it's only you and nobody else. And this is a part of the problem. Many people like yourself and other Zionists continue to invoke peace, right? Do you really think that you can go to a Palestinian who's lost his mum, lost his dad, lost his limbs, lost his home and say, hey, now let's have peace? Nonsense. Peace is a byproduct of justice. Justice is a byproduct of accountability. We are still stuck on accountability. Many Zionists, many Israeli representatives refuse to take any accountability to the point where they will even have laws like the Nakba law, that if any institution was to teach about the Nakba, a real life event, a real life atrocity that happened to Palestinians, they would get funding withdrawn from them. So to sit here and put the burden on a stateless group of people, refugees, without any military, without any form of proper governance, and try to hold them accountable for the mess that's been happening in the land, even though Israel is the one that has the majority power here, is completely disingenuous. It's a form of victim blaming, and this is why there's never going to be peace.
Oh, my Muslim brothers, I declare a jihad. Slaughter the Jews, slaughter them all. That was the rallying call of Hajimin al-Husseini pre the 48 war. They described their genocidal intention. They invaded Israel as soon as Israel declared independence with the intention of genociding the Jews. That intention has been carried up to this generation. We must attack every Jew on planet Earth. We must slaughter and kill them all with Allah's help. Fatih Hamid. From the inception of your movement that you're defending, there has been genocidal intention. And what happens is, time and time again, they raise their sword of genocide, come rushing over the border to perpetrate their barbarism, and they're defeated, and they then play the victim. The Nakba originally wasn't a Nakba because of any displaced Palestinians or Arabs in the war. The Nakba was if you read how it originally came about and how the language originally came to be, the catastrophe was that they lost the war. They were humiliated by the Jews and they failed to carry out their genocide. October the 7th, and I wouldn't be surprised if you were in on this as well. It would not surprise me. October the 7th, jubilation in the anti-Zionist camp. The Palestinians have broken out of their prisons. Victory, justice, intifada. 2 days later, alas, woe is me. What is happening? Why are we being genocided? Why are we being attacked? You are being attacked because you, like in 48, initiated the violence. And then you cry when the gates of hell are opened and the fire rains down on those that perpetrated these attempts at genocide. Now, I want to come back to something you initially said, because it's very important. You spoke about peace. In the 1930s, 1936, the Jews were offered 3.5% of British mandatory Palestine. The Arabs rejected it. The Arabs have consistently said no to every single peace proposal. From 1936, 1937, 1947, every single time the two-state solution was met with no. And every single time the Arabs took up arms to slaughter the Jews, they lost, and then they turned around and played the victims. And idiots in the West, and idiots in the Ummah, listen to their cries and believe them. Worse than that, they will get on the internet and stand there and say that Jewish 17-year-old, 18-year-old girls who were dancing and celebrating and dancing for peace deserve to be butchered. Deserve to be butchered. No one, no 17-year-old, no 18-year-old girl deserves to be butchered. And shame on anyone who would describe that as resistance. And yes, tragically, Palestinians have died in Gaza at a much higher rate than Israelis. I agree.
Killed.
And every single one of those deaths is on Hamas. Every single one of those deaths is on almost every single one of those deaths is on the leaders of the Palestinian people, because time and time again, they've chosen war over peace. If they are rejecting the Jews in 3% of the land, what on earth makes you think that they will agree to any peace solution? Every single map you see from the Palestinians, be they the moderates of Fatah, so-called moderates, or the extremists of ISIS, Daesh, or Hamas, or Islamic Jihad, it's the same map. It's all of that territory is Israel. And ironically, that map was drawn by the British. That keffiyeh that you're wearing, the design, came from Pasha Club. He had the Jordanian, to differentiate between the Jordanians and the Palestinians. They started with the red, which is right, the red and white design was originally the Jordanian and still is to this day. And the black and white was chosen to differentiate the Arabs from the Bedouin. If you knew your history, or the history you're defending, it's not your history, you've got nothing to do with the land, you'd know that. You'd know that you are wearing a colonial keffiyeh. So I think I'd like to move the conversation. You can respond to what I've said to something more constructive, and then we can call it a day and try to do this within an hour and a half. What next?
Okay.
My question to you is, what happens next?
I'd like to respond to.
Yeah, I said you
the
can
things
respond,
that you
and then
yeah. Yeah, sure. So again, when we talk about the 1948 and that the Palestinians didn't want to give you guys a state, that was never part of your plan anyway. Even though you were given certain offers, and you're being very manipulative about it, you were offered 6% or 3%, the Palestinians rejected, but so did the Zionists. The Zionists were actually bargaining for much, much more. And since 1948, even though the land was, kind of, you could say, split half-half, Israel has taken more land than it was already initially given, and it continues to take more land. Even outside of Israel, it has occupied the Sinai previously after war, built settlements over there. It currently occupies the Golan Heights. It currently has settlements on the border of Lebanon. So it is an expansionist idea. It's nothing about having a two-state solution, having Palestinians exist there. It's everything about trying to expand as much as you can, as sneakily as you can, in order to establish what I said early in the beginning of this podcast, is a greater Israel. And why do I say that? Because it's included in their charter, the Likud party charter in 1977, which specifically states that from the river to the sea will only ever be Israeli sovereignty. Netanyahu not long ago was in the United Nations showing a map of the greater Middle East. There was absolutely no signs of a Palestine on there. It was what you would define as a greater Israel. Again, I spoke about the resettlement projects that was headed by Ben-Gvir in order to resettle Gaza. We have settlements that have also newly been built in the West Bank. So you're doing everything to completely, again, ethnically cleanse and push Palestinians out of their homeland in order to establish and gain more land for your own people. So to act as if, again, the precursor to peace is the fact that Palestinians are being violent is simply not true. You are the precursor to peace. You are the ones who are actively taking and land grabbing more land. You are the ones who are making life completely unbearable for Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in hopes that they eventually leave. There have been multiple calls for them to repatriate and go elsewhere. Again, going back to 1948 and them starting a war with you, I would also argue that a bunch of European settlers declaring themselves a state on preoccupied land is a declaration of war in itself. I mean, if China decided to go to Texas and say, well, 50% is ours now. Whoever lives in our 50% portion needs to leave. If you don't, then we're going to forcibly remove you. That in itself is a declaration of war. What gives anybody the right to come, again, via colonialism? You keep on invoking colonialism. And again, Zionism is a colonial thought. Nationalism is not necessarily a Jewish principle. It's not a Jewish ideology. There is no such thing as, Zionism intrinsically within Judaism. People just called themselves Jews. They never called themselves Zionists. They never called themselves Israelis. These are colonial terms.
We never called ourselves.
These are colonial terms that you guys.
You said this earlier, Zoubida. I just need to correct you because you keep saying this and it's nonsense.
So how did you guys self-identify?
We called ourselves Bnei Israel, the children of Israel. We called ourselves Am Yisrael. We never called ourselves Jews. We don't even have the letter J in our language. We called ourselves Israel, and we lived in the land of Israel.
You called yourselves Yehudi, Yehudim.
You
called yourself Yehudim. You called yourself...
overwhelming majority of, or if you read any of our texts, we called ourselves Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. We called ourselves Israel. If you read our scripture, we're constantly referred to as Israel. Our land is called Eretz Israel. It's like, I don't know where, the land of Israel. I don't know where people get this narrative from. And the whole Jewish religion revolves around us being a nation in this land. We have institutions of government and there's laws that apply to the land. Like, this is a fantasy that people who don't know the first thing about Judaism advance.
No, I agree with you to a certain extent. I agree with the fact that you guys are trying to establish some sort of theocracy, and this is what I wanted to move on to. The Basic Law Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, is a bill that was passed, I think, in 2018, and explicitly says these are the basic principles. The land of Israel is the historic homeland of the Jewish people in which the state of Israel was established. The state of Israel is a nation state of the Jewish people in which it realizes its natural, cultural, religious, and historical rights. The realization of the realization of the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is exclusive to the Jewish people. I just wanted to move on to the 7 here so that we can
just on that. Have you read the Palestinian Basic Laws? Have you read the Palestinian Basic Law, which predates that and says exactly the same thing about the Arabs? And all it means is that the culture of this nation is Jewish. So we take Sabbath off instead of Sunday or Jummah, Friday. The language is Hebrew. The national language is Hebrew. The festivals aren't Christmas or Ramadan, although they are secondary festivals here and they're protected. But the character of the state is Jewish. There's one Jewish nation. And look at you, cry. You call me the Jewish supremacist? You call Zionists the Jewish supremacists? Your religion calls us Dhimma. We're a Dhimmi. We have to pay a jizya, a tax till we're Sagirun, humiliated. And you call us the supremacists? On your bike.
Yeah. So again, this is where the deception comes in, because one minute you're the only democratic secular country that, you know, has similarities to Western values, but on the other hand, you are calling for a Jewish theocracy here. So which one is it? You know, you have to be very clear of what your true intentions are, because you can't. And again, you're also calling for an ethno state, you know, which is very ironic. Again, because we know the ethno state.
This is the perversion of what you're doing. You twist the truth.
So it's not
As a Muslim, you're supposed to speak out. You're supposed to cling to truth. You're supposed to chase truth. Yet here you are perverting you speak with a forked tongue.
I'm reading from your own bills, Joseph. Your own bill literally says here that the state views the development of Jewish settlements as a national value and shall act to encourage and promote its establishment. And I've never actually asked you this. I didn't interrupt you. I know I understand what I'm saying.
Answer this question. Is England a Christian supremacist nation?
No.
Yet here we are. The national holidays are Christmas and Easter. It doesn't make it supremacist. There's one Jewish nation where we celebrate Hanukkah, Yom Kippur, Pesach. There's one Jewish nation where that's the national holiday. And look at you cry and wish it was under the boot of the Ummah. And wish it was once again.
I'm not arguing. That's not my argument here. What I'm trying to show you.
How is it supremacist?
Yeah, that's not my argument. I'm not speaking about the fact.
How is that supremacist? Every single Muslim state then is a supremacist state.
If you'd allow me to maybe finish and expand, because again, you give off this illusion that we've got 2.1 million Palestinians, but it explicitly says this is just for Jewish people. So there's a level of deception and misinformation that's being presented on the mainstream and actually what you guys believe in. You see, if you guys were open and honest about it and said this is a Jewish theocracy for Jewish people, fair enough. But to come and delude the people into thinking that we're a democratic country and we love the 2.1 million Arabs and we don't have a problem with them, whilst you have this enforced in law, is completely deceptive. Also, again, going back to my expansionist argument, point 7 of this bill specifically states the state views the development of Jewish settlements as a national value and shall act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation. So here they are asking for the building of illegal settlements specifically in Palestinian territory. So Israel clearly is not enough, okay? And you know the settlers that live in the West Bank are not all of them, but quite a large portion of them are influenced by this messianic Jewish, idea of the Messiah coming back, and it's very religiously fundamentalist, motivated. And this is the sort of people that they're dealing with. It's no different to ISIS claiming that they have to conquer the world because their interpretation of the Quran says so. We also have Jewish religious fundamentalists who are being backed by the Knesset, again, Smotrich, Ben Gvir. Okay, we have the IDF, whose sole purpose there is to either work on the borders or protect these settlements. So you're not going to sit here and gaslight me into thinking that, I don't know what I'm speaking about and that this is all in the fault of the Palestinians, because again, the power is within Israel's hand. How has Israel utilized that power? They've utilized that power to disenfranchise the Palestinians and continue to expand and continue to violate international law. Palestinians' hands are completely tied. And again, you sit there and you characterize, the resistance as terrorism and all these other things. But why are we acting as if Palestinians haven't utilized peaceful means of resistance? Why are we not acting like in 2018 when Palestinians for a week peacefully protested along the Gaza-Israel border, were met with bullets and over 260 people were killed, kneecapped in order to completely disable them from resisting again? Me and you also met with each other in 2021 outside the Israeli embassy, where we were peacefully protesting for them to continuously stop building settlements and tearing down Palestinian homes. Nothing was done. 66 resolutions were passed in the United Nations in favor of Palestine. Your greatest ally, America, vetoed every single one of them. Okay, let's not act as if humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations have not picked up the Palestinian case and tried to present it to the international world and have not been completely undermined and ignored. They have utilized peaceful means of resistance. Nothing has happened. So unfortunately, again, it's a logical thing. There's cause and effects. I understand it's emotional for you, but if we're going to look at this from a logical perspective and we're going to look at this as a cycle, then this thing was going to be the inevitable at the end of the day, because nothing is being done. If anything, after the Oslo Accords, nothing was agreed upon. You guys keep on putting the burden on Palestinians. They've never accepted peace. Well, first of all, they never really were involved in the peace processes. They were never really given a chance to speak and represent themselves as early as 1948, as early as the United Nations votes, which voted in your favor, which, by the way, was completely corrupt. The more and more I researched about that, when you guys come and have the audacity to say, well, the United Nations voted and they voted a majority for the state of Israel, go and look at how that vote was lined up. Go and look at how the Jewish Agency and the Zionist organizations threatened many of the UN delegates to vote in their favor, including the United States. Harry Truman, president at the time, himself even testified to the pressure and the harassment that he had to endure via the Zionist projects in order to vote in their favor. The Indian delegates threatened, Philippines threatened, Haiti threatened aid cuts if they didn't vote in favor of the Zionist entity. And bearing in mind, the United Nations was a very new organization that had to take over the League of Nations, so they were inexperienced. It was completely faulty, illegitimate as far as I'm concerned, and the United Nations is not even legally binding anyway. Lastly, I'd like to finish up with what I'm saying, since you brought a quote from one person, by the way. So let's actually look at what Hamas says about Jewish people, since you believe that as a body, as an organization, they're inherently anti-Semitic. There are people who will say anti-Semitic things. Again, condemn, I'm against that. I don't support that whatsoever. But if we actually look at their charter and their doctrine and what they truly believe in, their revised charter 2017 explicitly says, Article 16, I'm sure you've heard it many times, Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist projects, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. Yet it is the Zionists who constantly identify Judaism and the Jews with their own colonial project and illegal entity. Ahmed Yassin, who founded Hamas in 1987, on camera, his own words, specifically said, "We do not have a problem with the Jewish people. They are a people of the book. But if my own brother stole from me, I would resist him too." Yasser Arafat, as early as 1964 in his PNC charter, specifically called for a free Palestine, free from Jordan, free from Egypt, free from Israel, and wanted a Palestinian democratic secular state which included Palestinian Jewish people. Palestinians did not get to choose who occupied them at the end of the day. They're not fighting you because you're Jewish, because I'm sure you're aware, historically speaking, when the Mamluks occupied Palestine, they fought against them too. When the Ottomans occupied Palestine, they fought against them too. When the British occupied Palestine, they fought against them too. And when Jewish people occupied it, they also fought against them too. And I'm sure you're aware that they even went as far as assassinating, since they're all Arabs, their own Arab leader, king in Jordan. You know that the king of Jordan was assassinated in Jerusalem by Al-Aqsa Mosque. So to sit here and act like they're only fighting you simply because you're Jewish is disingenuous. As somebody who's half Algerian, when the French were occupying us, our beef was with the French who were occupying us. And we identified them with what they were, French. So when they're sitting there and saying, we're going to fight the Jews, well, that's who's occupying you. It's those Jews there that are occupying you. But if Palestinians generally wanted to slaughter all Jews, why are they not doing it outside of Israel? I would argue that some might even have a better chance outside than they would actually in Israel. So if there is an actual urge to just slaughter as many Jews as possible, there are 15 million Palestinians living outside of Israel. They're not doing it. You might argue that they'll go to prison, but if you strongly believe enough in something, you'll do it regardless of that. That's why these terrorists clearly don't give a shit. Well, sorry for my French, but nonetheless, to sit here and say it's everything to do with the fact that they're Jewish is completely incorrect. It's everything to do with their occupation, everything to do with the way in which that they've treated Palestinians. So again, tackle the disease, not the symptoms, and stop trying to deflect from the actual root issue at hand.
So you went all over the place there, so I'm going to deal very briefly with the latter part, but then bring it back to the more the grosser lie that you told, accidentally or intentionally, I don't know. So Sinwar stood at the Gaza border during the peaceful March of Return and screamed, "We will cross over the border and rip out their hearts. We will rip out their hearts." You had people then tearing down the fence and crossing into Israel with guns, with axes, with knives. The videos are all over social media. The presentation of the Great March of Return as peaceful is a corruption and a perversion of truth. Just like almost everything that you said is a corruption, a perversion of truth, and truthfully, a projection. You talk about supremacy and theocracies. Literally all of the states around Israel are theocracies, yet Israel is a democracy where there is religious freedom for all citizens. It's the only place where Baha'i are not persecuted in the Middle East. Be you Sunni or Shia, you have the same freedoms in Israel. The same freedoms. When we talk of a Jewish state, all we're talking about are the festivals, the language, the character. When we're talking about settlement, what that means is we call all of our settlements, all of our communities, Yeshuvim, settlements, be it over the Green Line or in Israel, be it Elat, be it Efrat, we call them by the same name. We've always used that language. We've used this language long before Arabic came to be spoken in the land, long before English came to be spoken in the land. We talked about our Yeshuvim, our settlements. There is a gross perversion of reality. You want to frame, like you talk about, if I want to be logical, if you could hold a logical argument, you would realize the cognitive dissonance that you've got. So the previous conversations we've had, either at Speaker's Corner online, you've complained about Israel being the gay capital of the Middle East, and how can you allow pride to happen there? It's an insult to Judaism. And then in the next breath, you're saying it's a theocracy, it's an extremist religious theocracy. It's like absurd. It's a democracy. You've called it a theocracy. Give me any religious laws. Give me one religious law. Like in the state, any halakha. Which of the halakhot apply to the state of Israel?
Well, is it your court system based on the similar judges system of 12 people? So it's a model of your ancient forms of judges based on the 12 judges that you guys have. We know that gay people are not legally allowed to get married. It's not recognized.
It is recognized. Again, you don't understand what you're talking. It's completely recognized. I have friends who have
gay people get married.
So what is the only law that Israel has continued? Or not the only law. The only religious law that applies is marriage, and I think we've discussed this before. And Israel continued, for the sake of peace, it continued the British law, which was a continuation
But
of
what
the
about
Ottoman law.
birthright? Birthright is
No, it's not. It's not. So non-Jews can move to.
so
So
birthright again.
non-Jews.
Birthright
Yeah,
is
Zoubida,
the right
Zoubida,
for a Jewish
Zoubida, listen,
person
listen.
to make aliyah. Aliyah is
Zoubida,
a Jewish
listen,
concept, right?
listen.
To go back to
Zoubida,
the
listen.
homeland.
Birthright applies to non-Jews. If it was, there are religious Jews want to stop.
That's a bit of a mischaracterization. So non-Jew is a non-religious Jew,
No, a
but
non-Jew,
could be ethnically Jew, have a Jewish family member.
non-Jew can move to Israel and have birthright. The laws of immigration are not based on religion. They're based on Nuremberg. They're based on the Nazi law. Whoever the Nazis would have killed has the right to move to Israel and seek sanctuary here. So those that are described as Jews by non-Jews.
So if somebody was born in Australia and they're Jewish, can they
Yes,
utilize
but if someone
birthrights?
is
They've never
not
been
Jewish,
to Israel. They're Jewish.
Listen to what I'm saying, Zoubida. You'll learn something. Listen. The right of return applies to anyone who has a Jewish grandparent. It has nothing to do with who is religiously Jewish. Jewish law stipulates if you convert or have a Jewish mother, you are Jewish. So there were people who moved to Israel, so much so that some Russians moved here and set up a Nazi cell in Tel Aviv around 15 years ago. There were literal Nazis in Tel Aviv who weren't Jewish who moved here under the right of return. Right of return is not a religious law. It's a secular, ethnic descent type law, which has nothing to do from a religious.
So can a Palestinian have the right to return?
So again, what did I just say? I said the right to return is based on anyone who has a Jewish grandparent.
So a Palestinian who is a descendant of, I don't know, the Naksa, let's say 1967. So can they utilize birthright to return or the right of return?
It's got nothing to do with religion. It's got nothing. You're describing it.
I'm not saying it does. I'm asking you. Okay, so you've educated me. You said to me the right of return.
Come on to the right of return.
Yeah, cool. But you've educated me, and I just want clarification on this.
We're arguing whether Israel is a theocracy. I'm showing how Jewish law has nothing to do with the right.
I understand that.
Okay, so we can come on to the right to return in a minute.
Right.
I want to deal with the. You said that Israel is a theocracy. So the only religious law that I'm aware of,
I would say that there are two schools of thought. I would say that Israel, and I'm sure you can agree with me, internally is fractured. You have the secular left, and then you do have the right-wing Messianic, thought over there that do want to turn it. Like for instance, the Orthodox Jews.
Is it a theocracy? You said it was a theocracy. I just want you to admit it isn't.
I would say it's trying to be. It's definitely trying to be, and that's where you guys are clashing because you have those. Okay? Can I just clarify that? Because you have some Orthodox Jews, Jewish settlers, who do not recognize the government of Israel. They don't believe in it. They believe in the Torah and what the Torah says. If what they are proposing contradicts the Torah, they don't listen to it. They don't give a damn about it.
So they're not in power. They're not the state. Yeah. They're not the government. It's not a theocracy.
Yes, they have people who advocate for them who are in power. People like Ben Gvir and Smotrich are representatives of those type of people.
So I would agree that Smotrich and Ben Gvir are religious.
You have a far-right coalition government who are
but Israel, I just want you
they're no different to ISIS. They're no different to religious. They're no different to ISIS in the way in which that.
I just want you to admit, instead of going through all these sound bites, that you misspoke and Israel is not a theocracy.
I would say that it has. I think it's trying to be. So if the right people got into power, they would definitely turn into that.
The only law that you can name, which is somehow religious, is a law that was created by the Ottomans. The British preserved it in the name of peace, and the Israelis then preserved it in the name of peace.
Well, like I said, in the Likud Charter in 1977,
because the audience may not be aware of that law. That law is the religious communities of Israel determine who can marry who. So Christians determine who Christians can marry, Muslims determine who Muslims can marry, and Jews determine who Jews can marry. And each of the leaders of those religious communities, the institutions, determine the laws. And there is it was not created by Israel.
But like I said,
in the name of peace. It's not to do with Jewish law, because that has nothing to do with Jewish law. Judaism doesn't talk of Christians or Islam because they came much later. They are rebellious children. And so I just wanted to admit that
it really depends upon.
I just want to see if you're big enough to admit that you misspoke.
Okay, so again, I think that it largely depends on who gets into power. I don't know why you're being disingenuous here. I know that if some of those crazies. Well, 1 second. I know some of those crazies, right? Because you have fundamentalists in your community. If they got into power, it has the potential of turning into a theocracy. Like I said, with the Likud Charter Party, okay, in their charter, it explicitly says from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, it will only be. Can I finish?
No,
Can I finish? Because that
What you're saying is
statement in the
absurd.
charter, of only. Okay, it's not absurd. Okay,
You're
again,
describing
when you
Israel
guys
a
have the
democracy as a
audacity, when
theocracy.
you
It's
guys
the
have, can
only
I finish,
democracy
please?
in the
Can I finish,
region.
please? Can I finish, please? Can I finish, please? When you guys have the chutzpah to come and say, "Oh, Palestinians, when they invoke from the river to the sea, this is a genocidal statement," that is what you call projection. Because who actually controls the borders from the river to the sea? It is Israel. Israel controls everything from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. But then you want to make the accusations that Palestinians want to do that whilst you're actively doing it. Again, it's in the Likud Party Charter, which explicitly says from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea will only be Israeli sovereignty. Where do you think they got that from? They got that from the Torah. When God defines the borders of Abraham's children, I think it's in Genesis or Exodus, where he explicitly says and goes as far as Iraq to the River Nile. This will be the borders for the children of Israel. You guys don't call it the West Bank; you call it Judea and Samaria. Okay, even politicians have used biblical terms to define the West Bank. Okay. And again, people like Ben Gvir, who was a religious extremist fundamentalist, okay, and as I've just read to you the law that literally says that they want to, again, establish more settlements. Let me just read it again so you understand. The state views the development of Jewish settlements as a national value and an act to encourage and promote establishment and consolidation. Again, they want to populate these areas in order, and some may differ. Some are secularists. Some want a secular Israel, okay, which is cool. And then you have those who want a theocratical Israel. You cannot sit here and deny that there are not religious fundamentalists the same way that we have in our own community. You know, fundamentalists are not just Muslims, by the way, right? We keep on hearing this Muslim extremist narrative, and we're forgetting about Christian extremists who are only supporting you because of their own weird interpretation of end time prophecies. You have Jewish extremists, again, who also want to establish a mimic of biblical Israel. So let's not sit here and just act like these crazies don't exist in these communities. And if given positions of power, we don't know what they could do.
This is what I find fascinating. When we talk about Muslim extremists, we're not talking about Muslims. We're talking about the ones that chop off the heads of the kuffar. That's who we're talking about. You describe and try to make some equivalency between an evangelical Christian who believes in end-day prophecy.
Is there no Jewish extremism?
So I'll give you an example, yeah? On the 7th of October, they took, the butchers took the corpse of Shani Luke back into Gaza, and crowds descended on the corpse and beat it and spit it as it was taken through the streets. Every single time Jews, not every single time, but when Jews wander into the wrong neighborhoods, they can be butchered and crowds will cheer. And it's not just the slaughter of Jews, by the way. It's not just the slaughter of Jews. There have been Palestinians.
Have you seen the way that settlers behave in the West Bank?
Literally,
throwing
Zoubida,
stones, poisoning the well, burning olive trees.
Zoubida, I go there. Unlike you, I actually see with my eyes what happens. You get your news from Al Jazeera, from Twitter, from B'Tselem, wherever.
Are you denying these things happen?
On the ground, I see it. So I'm not denying there are extremes.
I understand that, but are you denying these things don't happen at all?
Listen to what I'm saying. I accept that there are extremists in my camp. The difference is my extremists in my camp are not going around and beheading the kuffar. We're not going around doing that. Like when our extremists, yes, there are Jews who use racist language. There are even, tragically, Jews who've carried out barbaric acts, and we know them. And we've debated about them because you have to go back 30 years. You have to go to Baruch Goldstein, or you have, like, there's one or two instances of Jews carrying out acts that are comparable to something that's happening on a daily basis. Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, the Houthis. I can literally name group after group which butcher civilians, and while they do it, scream out, God is great, Alhamdulillah, all praise be to God. And these savages that do this disgrace Islam, they disgrace Muhammad, and they disgrace the Ummah. And it's tragic to see rational Muslims coming out and trying to defend or make an equivalency between them and some Bible Belt Christian in America.
Okay, so can I answer that? So again, you keep on talking about terrorist, okay? Well, let's actually define what a terrorist is. The legal definition of a terrorist is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation against civilians in order to promote political aims. Has the IDF killed civilians? Yes. Has the IDF intimidated civilians? near enough every day. Have they done it in order to promote political aims? Yes, the political aim is the state of Israel, which was founded upon a political ideology. So that definition is continuously being weaponized and misused, and being used on other people in order to delegitimize their resistance and just say, well, this is just simply terrorism. These guys are a bunch of Islamic fundamentalists. Forget about what they're fighting about. Just, demonize them. And this is a strategy that the Zionists have been using for many years, by the way. Any form of resistance, they have just minimized it to Islamic terrorism. And this is what you've essentially fed to the Western world. And then this is why things like Islamophobia exist, because you conflate resistance against occupation to Islamic fundamentalism. You think that Hamas and ISIS and Al Qaeda are all one and the same, and they're not. ISIS is a genuine terrorist group. They are actually sick, barbaric, fighting for nothing. Hamas was born out of resistance. Hamas's origins was rooted in fighting against occupation. Does everything that they do, their individual acts, do I agree with? Absolutely not. But the basis of why they exist is completely understandable from an occupation perspective. Now, let's actually go into terrorism within that region. The first ever terrorist attack to ever happen in the Middle East, let alone Palestine, was done by Zionist Jews. It was done by groups like the Argon, like the Lehi, like the Haganah. I challenge you to bring me any terrorist attack that was done before the state of Israel. And even the British defined them as such. They'd never seen something of that scale in that time, and the way in which that they bombed the King David Hotel, and the way in which that they bombed Arab cafes. I would refer to you and the audience to a document called the Black Paper, which was a commission's report written by Palestinians, which detailed the amount of terrorist attacks that were committed by the Zionist Jewish underground organizations, who later formed the IDF, by the way. Okay, the IDF was born out of these groups. When these groups were, dismembered and proscribed, they then tried to rebrand themselves and started to become IDF members. And we know that even ex-presidents and prime ministers were also a part of these proscribed terrorist groups who committed complete acts of brutality. The first, what you guys call the Palestinian terrorist attack, when it came to plane hijacking and stuff, didn't start until the 1960s. And the first quote-unquote Islamic terrorist attack did not incur until the 1970s. So to sit here and act as if Jewish people don't have a part to play in these extreme acts of violence is simply not true. Multiple assassinations have happened in America and in Israel, as we know, with the famous case of Yitzhak Rabin, who was killed. We know about cases of Folk Bernadotte, who was a Swiss diplomat who actually freed Jewish people from the concentration camps and ironically was killed by Zionist Jewish terrorist organizations. You have the most notable Kahanist, who was an absolute nutbag extremists, again calling for the extermination of Palestinians. We have organizations called the JDL, right? Before there was anything called the EDL, there was something called the JDL, the Jewish Defense League. Again, another prescribed Jewish terrorist organization. And this is all early, as going back to the 40s, 60s, 90s and whatnot. So to sit here and paint the narrative that it's just crazy Muslims doing what they're doing and invoking all these organizations that act as if historically speaking Zionists were one of the first people to actually introduce this sort of acts of terrorism within the Middle East is very disingenuous. And if we're going to go back ancient times, I'm not sure if you're aware of a Jewish splinter group called the Sicaris, who were referred to as zealots, who also, again, I found it very interesting when they resisted the Roman occupation. They raided villages, they took people hostages, they slaughtered men and women and children as well, by the way. And some people would class them as heroes within Jewish thought. Others will say, actually, no, they were heretics. But nonetheless, you keep on saying projection, but I say that every accusation is a confession.
Okay, so first recorded terrorism, as we understand it by the modern definition, would have been in the 19th century. It was Irish carrying out dynamite campaigns against the British.
In the
Middle East. You have the Nabi Musa riots, the Jaffa riots. You had military campaigns, violent campaigns. Campaigns waged against the British. So when the Jews, who are also in this is what's it's so difficult to debate with you because you constantly contradict yourself. At the beginning of the debate, you said Britain created Israel. The Zionist was a British colonial project. And then at the end of the debate, you're now saying that the Zionists were waging a terror campaign against the British. You can't have your cake and eat it. It can't be both. You literally can't.
Two things can be true at the same time.
If you actually understood the history, if you Instead of just reading the Wikipedia page on terrorism, if you actually read the history of the conflict, you'd understand the nuances between the groups. So the Haganah, for instance, were completely against the techniques of the Lehi. They were completely against it. So much so, and they're against the Irgun. And so much so, they were literally, they sank their own art, the Irgun ship, the Altalena. Like, you don't.
Were they terrorists?
So the British defined them as terrorists, absolutely. The British defined them as terrorists. I don't consider them to be terrorists.
Do you define them as
No,
terrorists?
I don't define. I'm not going to say every single Jew who lived there was not.
Even though they commit acts of
So,
terror,
for
killed
instance,
innocent
the most
people,
famous one being the King David Hotel, the bombing of the hotel. So that was a military headquarters.
Well, there were others. They
Listen,
kidnapped British soldiers,
Zoubida,
tortured
Zoubida,
them. They
listen.
bombed Red Crescent hospitals.
Zoubida, listen. You asked me a question, then I respond, and then you.
Sure.
So they targeted military institutions. They targeted the military. They were fighting what they believed was a liberation movement. They were liberating. It was an anti-colonial liberation movement. They were fighting the colonial power in the same way that you believe the Palestinians are fighting the colonial power, which is insane because it's literally the indigenous people. You talk about, like, I forgot what you mentioned earlier, but literally everything with, like, I can't take 2 footsteps here without bumping into Jewish history. Like, I can't walk through a field without finding a Jewish relic. Like, Jewish history is everywhere here. Our continued presence on this land is irrefutable, and describe this as a colonial movement is a perversion again of the truth. But there's no projection here. When people talk about Islamic extremists, we're not talking about devout Muslims who fast on Ramadan, who go to the masjid 5 times a day. That's not who we're talking about. Yet you made the equivalency with Christians who believe in end-day prophecies. It's a bizarre stance to take, to equate ISIS with a pastor in the south. Like, you can literally name the Jewish terrorists on your hand, and you did so. You named you described Kohanists. You can literally go to the individual instances in history and say, these guys. Literally, if I now type into Google News and type, like, into the news, I don't know, killed in terror attack, and search now, I guarantee within the last week there will have been killings in different villages in Africa from Al-Shabaab, from Boko Haram. There will have been killings by militant terror groups in Yemen, in Syria, throughout the Middle East. All of them carried out in the name of Islam. We call them Islamic extremists because they scream Allahu Akbar. They disgrace our God. We pray to the same God. Can you imagine the judgment they will get on Judgment Day for murdering a baby and screaming Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar at the same time? They have disgraced the name of Islam. And nobody is calling, well, I'm sure there are people calling, but I'm certainly not calling a devout Muslim an extremist. I actually respect devout Muslims. I draw inspiration. I nearly bought a house here in Israel at one point, which was not so far from the local minaret on the mosque. And I was looking forward to being woken up at night woken up at dawn by the call to prayer, because it would inspire me to pray at dawn, because I don't pray at dawn, and we should. It's preferable as Jews to do that. We're not bound by law. We can just pray in the morning, but it's preferable to pray at dawn. I draw inspiration from devout Muslims. So when we talk of extremism, we're talking about those who butcher in the name of Islam. And they have disgraced Islam, not Zionists who are spreading disinformation or whatever you claim. The people who disgrace the name of Islam are those who put the words of the Quran in their mouth as they carry out their atrocities. Now, because we've been on now, I want to do this in an hour and a half. We're already nearing 2 hours. I'm not going to respond to every point. I've got like loads of stuff written which I was going to go through. Like in response, I was capturing notes of everything you were saying. But instead, I'm going to try and move it to somewhere more positive. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, peace is a byproduct of justice. Justice is a byproduct of accountability.
Okay, what's justice?
I think right
to
now
that point, then, what do you mean by justice?
Okay, so those who have done what they've done to the Palestinians need to be reprimanded. People like Netanyahu, I would argue, and again, not just by my own metrics, by the ICJ, should be arrested and thrown into prison. That will set a standard. Okay, he has been an obstacle to peace. He has been a legislator for bad policy, And if there is no action taken, the same way that you guys want to reprimand, the Hamas leaders, same thing should be happening for somebody like Netanyahu. I would say end the settlements. Again, this is illegal. You're committing crimes. You're a criminal.
What you consider a settlement is
2004.
just that point.
The case
Is
of
Haifa
settlement.
is Haifa a settlement? Is Tel Aviv a settlement?
Well, these are pre-existing towns anyway that are occupied
So I'm
by
asking you, are they settlements?
Israelis. So I don't understand
Are
what
they
you mean by that.
settlements? Because you said, like, end the
No.
settlements.
I'm talking about the settlements in the West Bank.
Okay. So, like,
Okay.
Gush
So
Etzion,
these are illegal.
Gush Etzion is an example. That's a settlement? Yeah.
Any settlement that has been built illegally needs to be dismantled, like you did in Gaza in 2005.
But this is what
okay,
I'm
and the reason. Let me just qualify what I'm saying.
So basically, you mean that the Jewish communities that existed before 48, they are to be destroyed in the West Bank of Judea and Samaria, which is the original name.
You're putting words in my mouth.
No, it's not. I'm asking what. Okay, so
let me qualify what I'm saying to you. So the case of the settlements, you're not listening. Right. The case of the settlements was brought forth to the ICJ in 2004. It was deemed to be illegal. Right now, what you're trying to conflate is the building of settlements and the expansion of settlements. So they built the settlements and they've expanded upon these settlements, which again is illegal. You have the outpost.
I'm just asking a practical
You keep interrupting me. Sorry, I don't understand why you're defending illegal settlements on occupied territory. I don't understand why you're so adamant about defending something that is wrong, that is illegal.
We obviously have a different take on settlements, and I'm trying to ascertain what you mean. So there are 500,000 Jews living in Yehuda v'Shomron in the West Bank today, yeah? So I'm asking you, what happens to those people? That's all I'm asking.
Again, I'm not a decider on that matter.
But that's you're saying.
I'm sure it's going to be a case by case. I'm sure it's going to be. I'm sure it's going to be a case. I'm sure it's going to be a case by case situation. Okay. And this is something that you guys haven't prepared for. Let me just finish. This is something that you guys haven't prepared for. And this is why I noticed. This is why I noticed that a lot of Israelis are panicking, because they've never fathomed the day that maybe the Palestinians might win. And so they haven't got like a backup plan for their own people. They've never actually conceptualized, hey, what if the actual Palestinians win and we've got a bunch of settlements that we've built and we have no backup plan? What is going to happen to us? Again, these are the consequences of doing illegal stuff. So if you built illegal settlements, you are a criminal. So therefore you should be dealt as such. You should be dealt as a criminal because you're breaking international law and you're occupying people's lands. That's your responsibility, not the Palestinians' responsibility. You brought them in there. You can also take them out the same way that you did in Gaza. Okay, it's not a biggie, with all due respect. The same way you can displace over 750,000 Palestinians, you can also accommodate your own people if need be, with all due respect. And again, I want to make it very clear: nobody's sitting here saying no Jewish people are allowed in this land. This land wouldn't be what it was, or what it is, without the Jewish presence, okay? But the way in which that is happening, this is completely incorrect. You are the ones who have created divisions. You are the ones who built walls and created systems, one for this one for that one. You are the ones who split the land into three and keep people in these little enclaves. You did that. So to sit here again and put the burden on Palestinians as to what should happen to this one, what should happen to that one, we're not the ones who made it happen in the first place, essentially. So again, when we're talking about justice, okay, before we get to justice, we have to get to accountability. I've struggled to get any form of accountability from you in this conversation when it comes to anything that the Palestinians have been through. Netanyahu certainly doesn't care. He literally believes that it was the Palestinians were the cause of the Holocaust, right? People are, scared to use the word genocide, scared to admit that a Nakba even happened, want to play numbers games, and you think Palestinians are just supposed to shake your hand and say, hey, let's go live in peace with each other and let's dibble dabble. Now, you might bring the argument that I've met Palestinians in Israel that want peace. Fine, but their experience is not the same as those in Gaza, okay? Again, you want to say that I've met some Arab Israelis who want peace with Israel. Again, their experience is not the same as those in the West Bank. I am speaking on behalf of those who are living under occupation. I've spoken to the people that come from these environments, and I think it would be audacious to go to a Palestinian in Gaza after what they've witnessed after 9 months and suddenly say, hey, let's have peace. And it's very ironic as a Jewish person that you talk about this, because you should know better. This is what the Jews got. When World War II happened, there was a whole process called denazification where they specifically dismantled the Nazi ideology. They specifically prosecuted those people that were involved, to the point where you guys even hanged one of them in 1964. You hunted him down all the way from Argentina to make sure that there was justice served for those people that he killed. You get compensation to this day, right? There are still giving you reparations or compensation for what happened to you in Germany. There have been laws that have been created to specifically protect the Jewish people from any forms of hate crime, anti-Semitism. You guys invoke never again. Right? Never again. So we're supposed to never do what happened to you, but the Palestinians can't even get an inch of any form of understanding or accountability. And then you want to talk about peace. I'm being realistic, and after what's happened in Gaza, I think it would be audacious to even approach a Palestinian who has witnessed what they've witnessed for the last 9 months with peace. And it's actually gone way out of Gaza at this point. The world has really seen what Israel is all about, has witnessed some things that could never leave the human mind. I mean, atrocious videos. And I think we've gone past that point. I think right now there needs to be a ceasefire. There needs to be an end to the conflict. Humanitarian aid needs to get to Gaza. Those who are wounded need treatment, and you know, the safety and the security of the Palestinians is the main priority for me at this point. Building back Gaza, and then, you know, who knows what will happen in the future. But I believe that there has been so much damage that has been done. And again, we need to start with accountability before we get to peace. And I don't think Israel's ready to take any accountability for what they've done.
So nobody needed to read between the lines then. You were very, very clear. Your solution to this conflict is the ethnic cleansing of Jews from communities they've lived in before the advent of Islam. Before Muhammad came along and told over the Quran to the Sahaba,
I did not say that.
Before Muhammad came along and told over the Quran to the Sahaba, before Umar ibn al-Khattab marched into Israel from Arabia, before the Arab conquests, multiple conquests of the land, there were Jews living there. There were Jews in communities like Hebron. And for you to sit there and say the only ethical solution is the removal of these Jews from that land, and your words were, however, Israel got them in there, Israel can work out how to get them out. You are advocating for ethnic cleansing. Any solution that anyone proposes that creates refugees, in my mind, is an immoral solution. I would not sit here and say we need to remove the Arabs from Israel. Heaven forbid. The Arabs have every right to live in Israel and have the right to the same privileges that the Jews have, that the Christians, the Muslims, the Jews, whomever they are. They are all equal under the law. In contrast, under the Palestinian Authority, Jews are barred from citizenship. If an Arab sells their house to a Jew, they face death or jail. Your solution is not just. Your solution is the fate of the Jews throughout our history under various religions, Christianity, Islam. Your solution is yet again the ethnic cleansing of Jews from an area. And that is not just. A just solution would be that the Jews and the Arabs who live there remain there. That would be a just solution. They find a way to coexist. But you weren't talking language of coexistence. You were talking language of accountability and justice. And when pressed, what do you mean? Your response was ultimately ethnic cleansing. And anyone who listened to what you said heard it loud and clear. The Jews need to leave. Zoubida, never again. We have a state today, and we will fight to our last man and our last breath that we will not be ethnically cleansed from this land. We have no other land. We have nowhere else to go. We're tired of relying on others to save us. Today, we save ourselves. When Hamas rise up and murder our grandparents and our children, we fight back. We don't beg Muslim leaders to save us from Hamas. We don't beg America or Europe to come to our defense. No, we stand against those that seek to cut us down. And so far, all praise be to God, we have absolutely smashed each one of those that rose up to destroy us. When 5 Arab armies invaded Israel in 1948, we repelled them. It was 1 rifle for every 3 soldiers against some of the best equipped militaries in the region, and we repelled them. And we'll repel them again and again and again because we have no alternative. Never again for the Jewish people means never again. I pray for the day that Jews and Muslims can coexist in all of the territory that we would have once called British Mandatory Palestine. I pray for that day. I pray that Palestinian society goes through a denazification process, just like the Germans did. I pray that Palestinians aren't taught to hate Jews in schools as they were in UNRWA schools. I pray that the teachers of Palestinians aren't caught up in the massacre of Jews in terror attacks in Israeli territory. I pray for that day, and I pray that there will be a denazification process. I pray that instead of Qatar and Turkey and Iran being giving the strength to the Palestinians and funding, and in Iran's case, orchestrating what the Palestinians do, I pray that the moderate Muslim forces in the region are able to help the Palestinians rebuild their society and give them the kind of society that they could have had. Gaza could have been Singapore of the Middle East. Instead, it was turned into an Iranian proxy, and it was used to wage Iranian wars against the Jews. So I pray for the day that the moderate Palestinians and moderate forces in the region, like the Emiratis, rebuild Palestinian society, denazify institutions like UNRWA, and we can move forward together and share this land, because there is enough land and we're not going to kill each other forever. And please God, in our lifetime, we'll experience that. I'll give you the last word. You can have the closing word.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, look, at the end of the day, Zionism is what destroyed the relationship between Arabs and Jews. There's a rich shared history between Jews and Arabs stemming for thousands of years. Where do you think Jews come from? A beautiful coexistence, because essentially this is what Palestine symbolizes. It's a land of coexistence for the 3 main Abrahamic faiths and other people who have coexisted in this land. Zionism, a supremacist, nationalistic European ideology, is what completely destroyed that. It's what completely divided this region and caused the animosity that you see between both sides. So I always talk about treating the disease rather than the symptom. Again, I'm going to reiterate myself. It's not about Jews. It's not about no Jew should live in this land. If you're an occupier, irrespective of your race, religion, or creed, you are an occupier. If you are an illegal settler, you are an illegal settler, irrespective of your race, creed, or religion. Essentially, the way in which that Israel was created was at the back of Palestinians. You know, the way in which Israel was created was through the slaughter and the bloodshed of Palestinians. So they've left a trail of blood, thinking that it would not catch up to them. And this is why I talk about the accountability. The quicker that the Zionists and the Israeli government actually understand the plight of Palestinians, instead of just arrogantly dismissing them and just minimizing them to Islamic terrorists, then the quicker we would actually get to a solution. And I think that is the main cause of this problem. The plight of the Palestinians, the claims that they have against Israel, should be taken seriously. They are legitimate grievances against Israel. Aside from the extremists, I understand that there are extremists, but the people, right? The majority of people are not Hamas. The majority of the people are not PLO or Fatah. Okay, so to scapegoat the Palestinian people and just simply blame it, Hamas, and victim blaming, saying every single death of the Palestinians is on Hamas. Hamas didn't kill those people. Those people were killed directly by an Israeli rocket. They were killed directly by an airstrike that was commanded by an IDF soldier. They weren't killed by Hamas. So ultimately, we spoke 3 years ago, and the conversation wasn't as tense as it is now, but things have changed. Things have changed, I believe. Now they've destroyed anything to do with peace, and I think there needs to be much more serious approaches to this. And I think that the leadership within Israel needs to go personally. And I'm not the only person that's saying this. Israelis themselves are sick and tired of Netanyahu. He caused this. He allowed this to happen. Again, his bad policies is what triggered this spiral of violence to happen in the first place, because he never wanted to take their case seriously. He never wanted to actually do something about the problems that the Palestinians were dealing with. He decided to dismiss it, ignore it, thinking that it would resolve itself, thinking that the Palestinians would eventually just lay down their weapons and submit, which is not going to happen. The Palestinians, as much as you want to invoke, Jewish overcoming their fears and overcoming their enemies, the Palestinians do too. 76 years and they're still standing. 76 years and a Nakba and an ethnic cleansing and a land grab and everything, and they're still standing. So Palestinians also should not be underestimated. And what makes this different is the whole world is watching. Zionism, I would say, is a failed concept. I think it's endangered Jewish people more than it's helped Jewish people. I think it's put Jewish lives more in risk and left them more vulnerable than they were before. The idea of, again, re-establishing a Jewish homeland on preoccupied people, I just think is illogical. Jewish people living in the land just like everybody else, fine. But doing this separation, apartheid sort of, situation is just not working. It's failed at the end of the day. As much as you sit here and say Israel's going to stay, that whole region hasn't seen peace since it's been created. I'm sorry. You've created too many enemies out of your neighbors, which isn't a good thing for any country. You haven't done anything to resolve the grievances of the Palestinians. Some people will say, 1948 was a thing of the past, same thing like slavery was a thing of the past and whatnot. But in the case of Israel, it's not a thing of the past. It's still happening. It's still ongoing. And I would argue that you've been set up to fail. The colonialists, the British and the Americans who pump you with weaponry have set you up to fail. They've given you this illusion that you would be able to sustain yourself there long term. And by the way, as much as you guys are advancing, your neighbors are advancing too, right? Lebanon is advancing. Iran is advancing. Egypt's got a good stock of weaponry. And I'm not sitting here saying that something should happen to you, but with the bad policies, you isolate yourself. You make yourself more vulnerable, and you're setting your people up to fail by not doing the right thing. And at the end, the only main people that suffer are the innocent Palestinians and the innocent Jewish community. So, I mean, that's my last words, to be honest with you. Again, justice is a byproduct, peace is a byproduct of justice. Justice is a byproduct of accountability. We're still stuck on accountability.
Okay. Where can people find you? Your socials.
So Zoubida Al-Arabiya is my YouTube channel, Zoubida Al-Arabiya on TikTok. I'm sure your audience would not really, come to my stuff, but either way, for those who'd like to check me out, that's my stuff.
Right. Thanks for coming on. And it did get heated, but that is understandable.